They didn't just try to take away my backyard. They tried to take away my peace, my dignity, and the one thing that made me feel alive after my husband died. And it all started with a letter from the HOA. The envelope was thin, but it felt heavy in my hands. I knew it wasn't good news before I even tore it open. Inside, on stiff white paper, was the message. This neighborhood prohibits dangerous activities. Remove all shooting targets from your property within 10 days. I stared at the words, my throat tightening. Dangerous activities. That was their name for the single thing that had saved me in the darkest season of my life. I'll never forget the day my husband taught me how to shoot. We were younger then, laughing on a dusty field outside of town. He said it wasn't about hitting the target, it was about focus, patience, trust in yourself. When he died suddenly 3 years ago, those lessons were all I had left of him. Shooting wasn't about violence to me. It was about connection, discipline, and healing. Each bullet I fired into a paper target in my backyard was another piece of my grief worked through. Another breath I could take without breaking. But the HOA didn't see that at the next community meeting. I walked into the clubhouse with that letter folded in my pocket. The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the kind of sterile scent that makes everything feel more hostile. Around the long oak table sat the bored 3 men in golf shirts and one woman who looked like she'd never smiled in her life. Her name was Karen. And she was the kind of neighbor who knew everyone's business but had no kindness to spare. I barely sat down before she leaned forward and said, "We can't have someone turning this place into a shooting range. It's a family neighborhood." I clenched my hands in my lap, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I'm not turning it into a range. I practice in my own yard, with strict safety. I don't endanger anyone." Her lips curled into a smirk. "That's your opinion. But the rules are clear." The men nodded along, some more reluctantly than others, but none of them met my eyes. It was clear Karen was pulling their strings. She wasn't about to let go. That night, as I drove home, my chest ached with anger. This wasn't just about a few wooden boards and paper targets. It was about the way they looked at me as if I didn't belong. As if being a widow, quiet and alone, made me someone they could push around. I stood on my porch and looked out at the line of identical houses. All neat lawns and trimmed hedges. From the outside, our neighborhood looked perfect. But perfection is often a mask. Behind the manicured grass and polished smiles, people like Karen thrived on control. And now she had decided her control included me. The next morning, I found another letter shoved under my door. This one wasn't even typed by the board. It was handwritten. "You're making everyone uncomfortable. Stop before you embarrass yourself further." No signature. Just cruelty. I should have felt scared. Maybe I should have packed away my targets and avoided trouble. But instead, a fire lit inside me. Because it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the principle of it about not letting people like Karen decide who belongs and who doesn't. I set up my targets that afternoon, just like I always did. The air was crisp, the autumn leaves rustling in the trees. And the sound of my first shot echoed like defiance across the cul-de-sac. A few curtains twitched. I could almost feel their disapproving stares. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning, because people like Karen never stop at letters. They want a spectacle. They want to win in front of a crowd. And as much as I hated to admit it, some part of me wanted that too. I wanted the day to come when I could prove myself not with words. Not with arguments, but with the same steady hands my husband once guided. That night, as I sat alone at my kitchen table with the letter crumpled beside me, I whispered into the empty room, "They think they can silence me. But they don't know who I am." I didn't know then just how far it would go. That one woman's mission to break me would pull the entire neighborhood into a drama I couldn't escape. But I knew this. I was ready to fight. And when the day came that the HOA brought in their so-called experts to show me up, I would be there. I would be waiting, calm and steady, with one bullet that would change everything. The next week, the letters kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. Some were official-looking, stamped with HOA logos. Others were handwritten, messy, and spiteful. One even slipped under my door at midnight with a simple message scrawled in jagged letters. "Stop before we make you stop." I wasn't naive. I knew this was more than about safety. It was about control. About Karen deciding that I, a quiet widow with a backyard target, didn't belong. And the worst part, she had the HOA wrapped around her finger. Every board member nodded to her every word. As if my pain and my right to live peacefully were insignificant. At the next board meeting, I tried to reason with them again. My voice didn't shake, but my stomach did. I stood there in front of polished oak tables and crisp, uncomfortable smiles. The letters in my hand like evidence of my dignity being attacked. I follow every safety rule. I said firmly, "I've never endangered anyone, not even accidentally. All I ask is the right to practice in my own backyard." Karen leaned forward, folding her hands like a predator ready to strike. "Rules are rules," she said, voice dripping with superiority. "This neighborhood isn't a playground. We have families here. People should feel safe." I swallowed hard, holding back words I knew would get twisted against me. I am a neighbor. I live here. And my practice doesn't endanger anyone. You can check, you can inspect. I welcome it. A few of the men shifted uneasily in their chairs, glancing at each other, but Karen's smirk didn't falter. She knew she had them in her corner. She wasn't about to let me convince them otherwise. After the meeting, whispers followed me out the door. "She thinks she's special," one neighbor muttered under his breath. Another shook his head, lips pressed tight. I felt their eyes on me as I walked home, and a cold knot of frustration settled in my chest. They didn't see me. They didn't see the woman who spent hours alone in her backyard, practicing shot after shot, learning patience, focus, and control. They only saw someone who didn't fit the picture of what their neighborhood was supposed to be. That night, sat on my porch, staring at my targets lined up neatly in the fading light. The world around me seemed quiet, deceptively peaceful, while inside anger and determination roiled. I thought about my husband, about how he always told me to stand firm, to trust in myself. I could almost hear his voice whispering, "They can't break you if you know who you are." I started making a plan. If the HOA wanted to play this game, I would respond not with aggression, but with precision. Every shot I fired would be my statement, and I would not back down. No matter how much they tried to intimidate me, then came the most humiliating moment yet. I was watering my flower beds when Karen strolled past, perfectly styled hair and an air of superiority that made my blood boil. She stopped, hands on her hips, and said, "You really think you can keep this up without consequences? People are talking. They're watching. You're making a spectacle of yourself." I looked her in the eye, steady and unflinching. "I'm making a spectacle. Or are you afraid I might prove something to everyone here?" Her lips tightened, and for a moment I saw pure irritation flicker across her face. But she laughed it off, walking away with the air of someone who believed she had already won. I clenched my fists, taking a deep breath. Winning wasn't the point yet. Surviving this storm and proving my worth, that was the point. The next morning, I discovered a new letter taped to my door. This one was official, marked with the HOA's seal. "You are hereby prohibited from all shooting activities on your property. Failure to comply will result in fines and further action." Fines, further action. The words swirled in my mind like a warning bell. They wanted me scared. They wanted me to crumble. But all it did was fuel me. I wouldn't let them intimidate me into submission. I spent hours that day pacing my backyard, studying my targets, envisioning each shot. I imagined standing there with calm determination while everyone else, Karen, the board, the neighbors, watched. I wanted them to see what they'd underestimated. I wanted them to witness that the widow they mocked was not someone they could push around. Late that evening, I finally picked up my rifle and aimed at the steel plate I had mounted at the far end of the yard. The air was crisp, the sky painted with deep oranges and purples. My hands shook, but only a little. I steadied myself, remembering every lesson. Every whisper of encouragement, my husband had left me. I exhaled slowly. And as I fired, the bullet tore through the quiet night and struck dead center. The clang of metal echoed louder than any words. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the plate, feeling a mix of triumph and relief. This wasn't just practice. This was my statement. I wasn't afraid. I wouldn't hide. And if they wanted to challenge me, I was ready. The real storm, I knew, was just beginning. Karen wouldn't let this go. The HOA wouldn't back down. And as much as I hated to admit it, I was starting to look forward to the day when they would have to face me and the shot that would prove everything. It was Saturday morning when I realized this wasn't going to be just letters and whispered threats anymore. The HOA had outdone themselves. They'd arranged a community safety demonstration, which sounded innocent enough until I found out who they'd invited. The local SWAT team. I first saw the flyers pinned to the community board in the clubhouse. Bold letters screamed, "Join us to see professional shooting demonstrations. Family fun guaranteed." And their tucked-in smaller print was a note that made my stomach knot. Special participation may be limited. Karen's handwriting was on every flyer I saw. She had orchestrated this event, and it was clear she wanted me humiliated. I didn't know if they'd deliberately left my name out or if they thought I wouldn't show. Either way, the implication was the same. I didn't belong. I felt anger burn through me, sharper than I'd felt in months. I wasn't going to let them control me. Not now. Not ever. When I arrived at the field, it was everything I feared and more. Rows of folding chairs lined up neatly for the audience. Kids played nearby while parents sipped coffee, smiling politely at one another. The SWAT team stood at the edge of the field, their gear gleaming under the morning sun. And Karen. She was there in the front row, practically glowing with smug anticipation. Her eyes trained on me like a hawk. I took a deep breath, adjusting my jacket, and walked toward the organizer. "I'd like to participate," I said, my voice calm. The man blinked at me, surprised. "Oh, ma'am, this is mostly a demonstration. We weren't expecting—" "I know," I interrupted. "But I'd like to take a shot. One round. That's all I ask." Karen's eyes widened, and I could feel her smirk falter for a brief moment. The organizer hesitated, glancing at the SWAT captain. Finally, the man nodded. "One shot," he repeated. "No exceptions." I felt every eye on me as I stepped up to the shooting line. The rifle in my hands felt heavier than usual, but I welcomed the weight it grounded me. The steel target gleamed under the sun, a cold, metallic promise of judgment. Karen leaned over to whisper to the board members behind her. I couldn't hear exactly what she said, but the way their expressions tightened told me all I needed to know. They thought I would fail spectacularly. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the world fall away. I thought of the evenings my husband spent teaching me, his hands steady on mine, his voice patient. I thought of all the hours I'd spent alone in my backyard, honing my focus, my patience, my precision. And I thought of the letters, the whispers, the smirks, and the doubt that everyone had tried to press onto me. When I opened my eyes, the world was clear. The steel plate, the SWAT team, the audience, and Karen, they were all part of the test, and I would not fail. I raised the rifle, steadied my breathing, and lined up my shot. But then something happened that made my pulse spike. A small dog, a neighbor's golden retriever, apparently startled by the noise, darted across the field. The crowd gasped. Karen shrieked, pointing and yelling, "Stop her! She can't shoot with that dog there." I froze for a fraction of a second. It was chaos. The way the rules they'd imposed were suddenly dangling above my head like a guillotine. If I waited too long, the SWAT captain might call it off. The moment could slip away. But then I realized something. Hesitation would only let them win. Calmly, I adjusted my aim, accounting for the sudden distraction, and exhaled. The trigger squeezed under my finger, and the shot rang out. Time seemed to stop. The bullet struck dead center of the steel plate with a clang so loud it echoed across the field. The dog skidded to a stop, unharmed but barking wildly. The crowd went silent. Even the SWAT team stared at me, slack-jawed. Karen's smirk froze, her hands gripping the edge of the chair so tightly I could see her knuckles whiten. Her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to form words. But none came. Then the captain of the SWAT team stepped forward. He looked at me, eyes narrowing, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "That was the cleanest shot I've seen today. All the training in the world doesn't guarantee precision like that." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors clapped hesitantly. Others whispered to themselves. I lowered the rifle, my hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Vindication. Karen finally found her voice, though it was weak, almost strangled with rage. "Lucky shot," she spat. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. The bullet had already spoken, and the crowd had already seen. Later, as the demonstration wrapped up, whispers followed me wherever I went. People I barely knew came over, shaking my hand or patting my shoulder. Even a few of the board members avoided Karen's gaze. Their earlier certainty replaced with something else, hesitation. But Karen wasn't done. I could feel it in the tight set of her jaw and the storm brewing in her eyes. She would come back. She would try to humiliate me again, to force me out. And next time the stakes would be higher. That night I sat alone in my backyard, staring at the steel plate, thinking about the day's events. I realized this wasn't just about a backyard target anymore. It was about proving my strength, my focus, and my right to exist in a place where others tried to erase me. And I knew deep down that the next challenge was coming. Karen would escalate. The HOA would escalate. But whatever came, I would meet it head on. Because now they'd learned something important. I wasn't afraid. I wouldn't back down. And one bullet had already begun to tell my story. The victory I thought I'd earned didn't last long. Not even a week after the demonstration, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted like a storm rolling in. People who had clapped politely now avoided me entirely. Doors closed a little too quickly when I passed. And Karen. She wasn't just angry, she was relentless. It started with another letter. This one wasn't written in her familiar scrawl. Stamped with the HOA seal and printed in bold type. Immediate cessation of all shooting activities. Known compliance will result in legal action and fines up to $5,000. I crumpled it in my hands, breathing through the rush of frustration. They were serious. They weren't going to let me continue, and they weren't going to back down. This wasn't a game anymore, it was personal. That evening, I decided to face it head on. I set up my targets in the backyard as usual, the steel plate gleaming under the golden sunset. I loaded my rifle, feeling the weight steady in my hands. This was my sanctuary, the one place where I could breathe and remember who I was. And then I heard the tires. A black SUV rolled slowly past my driveway, its window down just enough to catch my attention. Karen sat inside, alone, her expression twisted with satisfaction. She leaned out slightly and called, "Better check those bullets. Don't want to miss your last chance, widow." I froze for a second, pulse hammering. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her she had no right. But I didn't. I just stared at her coldly until she drove off. My hands were trembling, but not from fear. From anger. That night, sleep was impossible. My thoughts circled like vultures, each one landing on the same conclusion. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce rules anymore. She wanted me gone. And if the HOA was complicit, there was no one to stop her but me. The next morning, I woke to a shocking sight. My carefully arranged targets, my steel plate. My paper bullseyes had been knocked over, scattered across the lawn. Some had dents in places they shouldn't. Someone had come onto my property. And they hadn't just sent a message, they'd invaded my sanctuary. A part of me wanted to cry. Another part wanted to explode. I walked among the damaged targets, scanning for evidence. Footprints. Tire marks. Nothing conclusive. Just the quiet aftermath of someone's deliberate act. I knew who it was. Karen. She had to be. No one else had the obsession to follow through like this. I called the HOA office. Their secretary answered politely. But when I asked who could be held responsible for trespassing on my property, The line went cold. They wouldn't help. They weren't going to help. That's when I realized something terrifying and thrilling all at once. If I wanted to defend myself, I was entirely on my own. I spent the rest of the day reorganizing my backyard. Each target carefully positioned, each angle double-checked. Every shot I took from now on wouldn't just be practice, it would be proof. Proof that I wasn't going to be intimidated. Proof that Karen and the HOA couldn't take my life apart without a fight. Then came the knock on my door. I opened it to see a young officer standing there, not smiling, not friendly. "Ma'am, we received a report of disturbances in your backyard. Some neighbors are concerned." I fought to keep my voice steady. "Disturbances. My targets. That's my property. I haven't broken any laws." He hesitated. "There's some concern about the safety of the setup, but I need to ask, you have firearms here?" "Yes," I said quietly, "and I have every right to use them safely in my own yard." He nodded slowly, as if measuring my resolve. "Be careful. Things are escalating," and that was it. No help, no protection, just a warning that the neighborhood was watching. And some part of the system was already ready to blame me if anything went wrong. Later that evening, I stood by my steel target, rifle in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. My hands were steady, but my mind raced. Karen had crossed a line. The HOA had done nothing. And now the entire neighborhood was a battlefield of whispers, judgment, and threats. I realized something chilling. This wasn't just about a backyard target. It wasn't even about me being a widow who enjoyed shooting. This was about pride, control, and fear. And if I wanted to survive, I would need to be smarter, faster, and more precise than anyone who dared to challenge me. As night fell and shadows stretched across the lawn, I made a silent vow. No one, no Karen, no board. No neighbor would intimidate me again. I wouldn't hide. I wouldn't apologize. And when the time came, they would see exactly what I was capable of. That's when I noticed something on the edge of the property line, shadows moving among the trees. My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't panic. I was ready now. Whatever came next, I would face it. And I had a feeling it was coming sooner than I thought. I picked up my rifle, loaded a fresh round, and looked at the steel plate. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow I would make my stand. The next morning I woke before dawn. There was a quiet in the neighborhood that felt unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, and looked at the backyard, the battlefield. My steel target glinted in the first rays of sun, and I felt a surge of clarity. Today I would prove that no one, Karen, the HOA, the entire neighborhood, had the power to control me. I heard tires crunching on the gravel before I saw her. Karen had arrived early, parked her car at the edge of my property, and was already pacing. Her face was red with anticipation, her hands gripping her phone as if she were recording everything. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered behind her, whispering, their eyes darting toward me like they were spectators at some spectacle. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. My rifle rested against my shoulder, and my fingers wrapped around it like it was an extension of myself. "You really think you can do this?" Karen called out, voice trembling between rage and fear. "This is the last chance you'll ever have. One wrong move, and it's over." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every letter, every whispered insult, every sneer that had followed me through these past weeks. "One shot," I said calmly. "That's all I need." The SWAT captain had arrived too, along with a couple of officers who had been watching the escalating situation. He gave me a nod of reassurance. It's like a silent reminder that skill mattered more than spectacle. Karen's smirk faltered when she saw that. She leaned forward, hands on her knees, staring at me as if she could will me to fail. The crowd quieted, and suddenly the entire cul-de-sac felt like it had shrunk down to the small patch of backyard between me and the steel target. I raised the rifle, aiming carefully. I heard my husband's voice in my head, steady and gentle. "Focus, one step at a time. You've got this." And then everything happened at once. A neighbor's dog ran across the yard again, yapping loudly, startling some of the spectators. Karen shouted, waving her arms. The crowd murmured in alarm. My heart raced. This was the distraction the moment they hoped would break me, but I didn't flinch. I exhaled slowly, focused on the target, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out like thunder. The bullet struck the steel plate dead center. The clang echoed across the field, silencing everyone, freezing the moment in time. For a heartbeat, the world seemed suspended. The dogs stopped barking. The wind stilled. Even Karen's breath seemed to catch in her throat. Then came the reaction. The SWAT captain stepped forward, nodding, his voice steady and loud. That was the cleanest shot of the day. Precise, calm, controlled, exactly what training and focus are meant to achieve. The crowd erupted. Not in mockery, not in whispers, but in stunned applause. Neighbors who had scowled at me for weeks now clapped. Some hesitant, some awestruck. Even the board members of the HOA looked shaken, their authority crumbling before my eyes. And Karen. She stood frozen, her face pale, hands trembling. Her eyes locked on mine, not with triumph, but with disbelief. "Lucky shot," she stammered, though even she knew it wasn't luck. I lowered the rifles slowly, feeling the adrenaline drain, leaving a profound, almost dizzying satisfaction. This was more than a shot. This was a statement. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't going to hide. And I wouldn't be bullied by anyone ever again. Then came the unexpected twist. One of the neighbors, someone I barely knew, stepped forward. I didn't know you were this skilled," he said quietly. "I think we've all underestimated you." A ripple of murmurs followed. Others nodded, some averting their eyes, some hesitant to confront Karen openly. For the first time, I felt the tide turn. The narrative that Karen had spun for weeks that I didn't belong, that I was reckless and dangerous was unraveling in real time. Karen tried to regain control, shouting accusations and threats, but her words fell flat. The crowd wasn't listening anymore. They had seen the proof, the undeniable truth. And no amount of her manipulation could erase that. I felt tears sting my eyes, but they weren't from fear or frustration. They were from relief and release, the culmination of weeks of tension, humiliation, and quiet rage finally bursting into clarity. I had taken back my power, not through anger, but through precision calm. And focus. By the time the event ended, Karen had retreated, her expression a mixture of rage, shame, and disbelief. The HOA board avoided eye contact, and whispers of admiration and apology began circulating among the neighbors. Some still avoided me, but others came forward with cautious respect. As I packed up my rifle later that evening, I stood in the backyard, the steel plate reflecting the dying sun. I realized something important. This victory wasn't just about winning a confrontation. It was about reclaiming my space, my peace, and my voice in a world that tried to silence me. I also knew this wasn't the end. Karen would return in some form, and the HOA might try other tactics. But I had learned something crucial. I was stronger than their threats, steadier than their whispers, and capable of standing my ground when it mattered most. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled, not the cautious smile I'd worn for weeks, but a real, quiet, triumphant smile. I had faced the storm, and I had won. The days after the showdown were quiet, almost eerily so. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, as if uncertain how to behave around me now that the truth had been made so public. Karen didn't speak to me, at least not directly. She would glance from a distance, lips pressed tight, her face twisted with a mix of anger and disbelief. The HOA, too, had changed their tune. The letters stopped. No more fines. No more warnings. In fact, a week later, a brief notice appeared in the community newsletter. Designated backyard shooting practice is permitted under safety regulations. No one mentioned my name, of course, but I knew everyone knew who had made that happen. Walking through the neighborhood that morning, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and relief. The air seemed lighter somehow, the houses brighter. People nodded politely, some even smiling. A few neighbors I had never spoken to came by to compliment my marksmanship or ask for tips. Their admiration was cautious, tentative, but it was real. And I realized something important. Respect is rarely demanded. It is earned, sometimes under the harshest of tests. I spent that afternoon back in my backyard, setting up targets and taking careful shots. Only this time, I wasn't doing it to prove a point. I wasn't doing it for Karen or the HOA, I was doing it for me. Each shot was steady and precise, not as a challenge, but as a reminder that I had found my strength not in confrontation, but in persistence.com. And belief in myself. Karen never left the neighborhood, of course. But she became quieter, less brazen. The board no longer acted on her whims, and the petty control she tried to exert slipped through her fingers. It was fascinating to watch her influence wane, not through my interference, but through the undeniable truth of who I was, capable, unshakable, and no longer afraid to claim my space. I thought a lot about what this had all cost me emotionally. The weeks of letters, the whispered judgments, the public humiliation, it had been exhausting. And yet it had also shown me something I hadn't fully realized. Strength is often quiet, but it is never invisible. You can hide it, doubt it, ignore it, but when it's called upon, it reveals itself in the most unexpected moments. One afternoon, a neighbor came over, hesitant but sincere. I just wanted to say, I didn't understand before. I thought it was strange, the way you handled yourself. But after seeing it, I realized you're incredible. What you did out there. It wasn't just skill. It was courage. I smiled, feeling a warmth I hadn't expected. Thank you. That means more than you know. That night, I sat on my porch, looking out at the rows of houses under the soft glow of streetlights. The steel targets in my backyard glinted faintly in the moonlight. I realized that I wasn't just defending my right to practice shooting. I was defending my right to exist fully and unapologetically as myself. And that lesson, more than anything else, would stay with me forever. I thought of Karen too, not with hatred, but with understanding. Some people try to control others because they are afraid of their own weaknesses. Her anger and her schemes were reflections of her own insecurities, and no matter how loud she was, she couldn't erase what I had built. Resilience.com. And self-respect. My husband's voice lingered in my memory, comforting as ever. Trust yourself. Stand your ground. You are stronger than you think. That had always been true, but now I understood it more deeply. Strength isn't measured in force alone. It's measured in endurance, in patience, in the courage to act even when everyone else doubts you. As I placed my rifle back in its case for the night, I felt a sense of closure. The conflict with Karen and the HOA had changed me. Yes, but it had changed me for the better. I was no longer the quiet, timid widow who feared judgment. I was someone who could face opposition, stand firm, and emerge stronger on the other side. And perhaps the most important lesson of all was this: respect cannot be demanded. Rules cannot silence truth, and courage cannot be dictated by fear. It lives inside you, waiting for the moment you need it most. I leaned back in my chair, looking up at the stars, and whispered to the night, I am here. I am strong. And no one, not letters, not threats, not even fear itself, can take that away from me. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. Not because the battle was over, but because I had won it on my own terms, and that victory was mine forever.